Hey everyone. We're gonna wait for a few more people to get into the webinar, and then we should start here in about 3 minutes. Okay. We'll get started here. TL, did you want to come on and do some of the access so folks know how to access the captions and what's going on with the interpreters?
This is TL speaking. I want to first thanks everybody for joining, and I want to make sure that everyone has the appropriate access that's necessary. Tonight we're working hard to ensure that looks like my interpreters. We're working hard to make sure that we have full language access to the best of our abilities, and it's not going to be perfect. A lot of the concepts being talked about tonight don't necessarily have signs, for example. A lot of interpreters deaf and hearing are on the webinar today, and we plan to host separate conversations about how to develop some signs around those things. So we ask that everybody give us grace. If you have issues, you should type in the chat box here. Also, captioning is available. If you go down to the bottom of your screen, if you're on an iPad, it should be in the same place. It's normally a green button that says CC. So if you click that, it says activate subtitles, and you want to click that. And then you'll start to see the subtitles, the captioning. You can change the size of those captions if you prefer them to be a little bit larger, if you go up to the top in your settings menu. And this is TL. I'm going to invite one of the Spanish interpreters to provide information about how to get on the Spanish translation line. We've dropped it in the chat box. I'll drop it again. But for people who are understanding me right now, the Zoom meeting ID is 966-1904-5800. And there's a number of phone numbers, so I'm gonna cut and paste again. And I'll invite one of the Spanish interpreters to just voice how to join your translation line. Thank you.
Sí, bueno, ahorita voy a explicar cómo poder entrar en la línea de español para poder tener acceso a este taller. Solo un momentito para que me puedan dar información. Bueno, para poder entrar, puede ir a https guión ahí está escrito en el chat, está escrito el link para poder entrar. Es j/j/J/1966-1904-5800. Y de ahí vamos a estar interpretando este seminario. También puede llamar a un número directo y el número para poder llamar en su teléfono directo es, dependiendo de dónde está usted locado. Si está en Chicago, Atlanta, Nueva York, Miami, Los Ángeles, Houston, Phoenix, San José, hay diferentes maneras para poder llegar ahí. Si quiere una manera para solo apretar un botón, aquí lo voy a poner en el chat. Ay, puchica. Perdón. Ahora lo estoy poniendo en el chat.
Sí tenemos. Ahorita.
Gracias.
De nada. Dustin?
All right, so want to appreciate and thank everyone for joining us. First, I want to thank the interpreting team, both the ASL and Spanish teams. Want to thank all the panelists and let folks know that people volunteered to do this. They volunteered energy, labor, in a time where many of us that have been entrenched in disability justice work are quite frankly exhausted, are at capacity. It's very hard to think at times. And we are seeing and ourselves being at targets for risking contracting COVID and then also death, quite frankly, if contracted. So I just want to like put that into context and what that means for all of the panelists here that are deeply engaged in this work. and just want to give thanks to them for doing this one. And then two, for what they'll share. The idea behind this was to, one, be a representation of what it looks like to self-organize outside of institutions. None of this was done with institutional support, and we're able to be powerful in ways that we don't recognize all the time when we rely on each other for to meet the needs that we have. So HERD, who is helping educate and advance the rights of deaf communities, an organization that works to free and support formerly and currently incarcerated deaf people. They provided some funds for us to be able to get some of the access that we have. Allie Cannington, somebody who I met in the disability rights and independent living movement, somebody that is a tower or a pillar in our community, also provided funds for this to happen. And then we self-funded the rest. That's important for folks to know in thinking about how important access is and what that means to include everyone. When I think about access, I think about enslaved people coming up with songs and singing them to a certain rhythm in order to not leave anybody behind. And knowing that we're operating and working in that same lineage when we talk about what disability justice is. Access is also a verb. It's something that is continuous and it's an action. So as things come up, as they always do, we will pause. We will pause for the interpreters. We will pause for ourselves. We'll pause for all of us and get it figured out, because it's important that we're not leaving folks behind. And I don't want to like spend too much time putting this talking really. So I do want to say that everybody on the panel is somebody that has been engaged in disability justice work, whether that's on the ground, whether that's in a policy form, or if it's in praxis and theory. And the idea is to just get their thoughts of what they're thinking right now. So each person is going to speak for about 10 minutes. We'll take breaks in between. And then at the end, there will be time for questions. There's a Q&A feature at the bottom if you're on the Zoom webinar where you could ask the questions. If you're on Facebook, you can type them into the Facebook chat, or you can drop them in the Zoom chat. We'll compile those and get as many answered at the end. So yeah, I won't spend too much time. If Azza could come on and get us started off.
Description of yourself, please.
Yes. Hi, this is Azza. I'm a Black femme presenting person wearing a yellow scarf with curls peeking out. I want to thank Dustin and TL for inviting me to be in this space with you. I'm really honored to be part of this, and I want to thank the interpretation teams and everyone who's put in time, labor, and funding to make this happen. Since I am the first person to speak, I'm going to kind of focus a little bit on a systems level and kind of higher level analysis of what ableism is and how it shows up and intersects with other systems. And so to begin, I think the easiest way that I encourage people to conceptualize what ableism actually is to think about it in terms of kind of ranking and categorizing bodies and minds as either normative and desirable or deviant and disposable. And that ranking and categorizing of body minds, and I use that phrase deliberately because bodies and minds are not separate, they are connected. The process of ranking and categorizing them is one that's inherently racist, one that is inherently anti-Black, and one that is inherently capitalist. And I'll expand on all of that. The way that the determination of who has value and who is disposable is based on capitalist understandings of productivity. So a body mind that is able to produce is a body mind that is valuable to the state. And a body mind that is not able to produce is a body mind that is disposable to the state. And in addition to that, when we think about how racism and anti-Blackness and settler colonization show up and inform and shape every single institutional arrangement in this country, that project is inherently ableist, right? It leverages the system of ableism, and it leverages the system that dehumanizes systematically disabled, mad, and neurodivergent people. So it works in a way that takes advantage of ableism in order to further advance the concentration of wealth and power at the very top. And I start there because I want people to understand that Black people, negatively racialized people, are impacted by ableism, even if that's not their, the way they identify and it's not their lived experience. Because that process of ranking and categorizing is going to sweep them up just by virtue of the fact that they are Black, brown, Indigenous. And I'll give you an example. Not that long ago, there was a case in Florida where a Black woman was approached by a police officer, and the police officer was trying to figure out a way to justify his violent conduct and treatment towards her. And when he did that, he did it by saying and invoking a legal statute or act in Florida that's used to detain people who have mental illness or people who are mad. And the way that he did that and that interaction played out involves him invoking the Baker Act, and saying, well, if I can't detain you because you didn't actually break a law, then I'm going to detain you this way. And that's important because this Black woman was not actually disabled, but because the entire system was constructed in this country in a way that criminalizes and dehumanizes disability and disabled people, the carceral or the law enforcement apparatus was able to capture, confine, and incarcerate this person using ableism and using the systems of ableism that exist and are embedded within the institutions and structures of this country. So in order for us to be equipped to tackle and dismantle these oppressive systems, it requires that we center and follow the leadership of people who are most impacted by it. And that's going to be people who exist at the nexus of those systems, namely Black, Indigenous, and other people of color who are themselves disabled, who are themselves mad, and who are targeted by these systems in a way that's compounded and intensified. And this is really important too, because I've already made reference to how the carceral system and the law enforcement, criminal legal system are working to exert control over people who are categorized as other, as not valuable, as disposable. And often when we talk about abolition and when we talk about the importance and the moral imperative of abolition, we tend to think of it in very narrow ways. Often people kind of limit it to jails and prisons and cops. And while that is definitely a huge part of it, that is not all of it, right? There are so many ways that the state exerts carceral control over BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, and exerts carceral control over poor, disabled, and mad folks, even when it happens outside jails and prisons. So to give you an example, the way that public benefits like supplemental nutrition assistance or food stamps, as many people know it, or other kinds of benefits. The way that those are administered and provided is itself done in a punitive and carceral way, right? That system is used by the state to exert control over those people. And the way that shows up is in how much invasive information people who apply to receive benefits are expected to give up, the intensity of the surveillance that's done, the presumption of criminality that's attached to them and used to justify that extensive surveillance, and the fact that cops and the criminal legal system, the carceral system, will use these programs to extend its reach beyond where it typically people think of it ending, jails, prisons, and other kind of sites of carceral control. So, for instance, people who have violated, and I'm using air quotes because these are so arbitrary, but people who they claim violated parole, for example, not only does that mean that they're at risk of being disappeared into a jail and a prison again, but it also means that the state stops their access to benefits. So they are not only being incarcerated, they are being politically and economically disenfranchised as well. It is an example of how the carceral system and the carceral process extends well beyond jails and prisons and has become embedded in these other institutional arrangements and structures. We see this in various other places as well. Schools are frequently and often ordered and designed in a way to exert control over Black, brown, queer, trans, disabled people within those settings. And I raise all of this, and I want to be mindful that this is the kind of natural progression of a history of centuries of oppression, violence, and labor extraction and theft in this country. So this entire process and these systems, which don't just intersect, but they depend upon one another, and they leverage each other in order to perpetuate these systems of domination. And I have found myself in the context of COVID-19 reflecting on the ways that those with power map onto certain bodies and body minds notions of disease, of desirability, and of disposability. And right now we are seeing how this is playing out in the pushes to ration access to care, right? And deciding who is worthy of investment to provide them treatment and care, and whose lives are disposable. But at the same time, the very groups that are being determined disposable are also the groups that are disproportionately represented in the roles that are now being identified as quote unquote essential. And I find that very interesting, right? Because as individuals, as individual people, we are disposable. But as a group, our labor is still being extracted violently in order to continue to protect capitalism and in order to continue to reproduce the kind of caste that has been created. And that is utterly consistent with the histories of violence within this country. Before emancipation, enslaved people were described as being immune to disease, and that they had particular abilities that were used to justify the conditions of their confinement and their enslavement. And then once enslaved people became freed, the people with power who had once designated them as being immune to certain disease were now shifting the discourse entirely and claiming that Black people are more susceptible to disease than white people, and that therefore they needed to be monitored and controlled. So you can see that the language and the justifications and the descriptions of who is and is not diseased, who is and is not well, who does and does not have power, play into which categories of people are designated as having value and which categories of people are determined to be worth protecting. So I will leave it there, but I know that there's Q&A later, so I can hopefully delve into anything that was unclear. Thank you.
Thank you, Azza. For folks, if you couldn't tell, Azza is brilliant, and so appreciate that the ability to be able to give us an aerial view and situate this conversation into a context that is digestible. I dropped Azza's Twitter profile in the chat. I'll do that one more time. There's also some brilliant writings online that folks can find, and we'll send out with the follow-up email. But next, I'll invite Nirmala to come and share. Nirmala is a professor, somebody that has written quite a bit about the intersections of race and disability in education, and I will let her take the floor.
Can you hear me? I'm Nirmala Erevelles, and I'm a South Asian Indian. I have, it's very hard to describe me, but I have glasses, I'm wearing a blue shirt, and I have shoulder length dark hair. I'm also very grateful for actually Dustin inviting me to be part of this panel, and honored and humbled. And I hope I have something that I can contribute to this really thoughtful discussion that is happening. I am a person of color who has learned a lot about how to see disability, how intimately disability and race are connected to each other, so that you cannot talk about race without engaging disability, and you cannot talk about disability without engaging about race. And I'm also, as Dustin just said, I teach at the University of Alabama, but I'm also a parent of a teenager in a public high school in my town of Tuscaloosa, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, which has more, and the school my daughter goes to has more than 80% of the children who receive free and reduced lunch. That tells you that the majority of the children in the school come from families that experience the harshest racial and economic oppression in their day-to-day lives. My passion has always been to see how best we can meet the intellectual as well as the emotional needs of these children in this public school system. And my research and advocacy is kind of connected to how best to articulate this intimate relationship between disability, race, class, gender identity, and sexuality. Now, Azza just made a really thoughtful breakdown when talking about how ableism is inherently a racist project and also an anti-Black project. And so, as Azza has also argued, we cannot, even those people who are Black, brown, and indigenous are impacted by ableism, even if they do not have that label. And that is the context in which I want to talk about this is the context in which I want to focus on disability justice. This is because white supremacist capitalist institutions, I am going to argue, appropriate, in other words, take without permission, the labor that disability is forced to do via the carceral state. And I'm making this argument because I'm saying that the way the state does it is it first criminalizes these body minds and then justifies this violence against them, especially those body minds that are the intersections of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. For example, in the southern states of Georgia, to a large extent, but also Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana, the public highways and the industries that were built in the 1800s and the 1900s were all done with, actually the early 1900s, were all done by the use of the convict leasing system and the chain gang. Most of the people who worked on these chain gangs were imprisoned because of minor offenses, but they were kept imprisoned with longer sentences because they drew on ableist conceptions of disability. And they used terms like degenerate, and I'm putting them in quotes because they're not real terms again, but they're violent terms. Degenerate, pathological, imbecile, cognitively deficient. And they use these to justify the most brutal violence against Black prisoners, men and women. So here you can see that disability becomes a social and a political category. It's not just, the so-called medical one. It goes beyond that to talk about it being social, political, and of course, racial, that was used to create the incarcerated person and to justify this incarceration and the ensuing violence that occurs. So in many ways, incarceration the experience of incarceration lies at the intersections of race and disability. But because my work is in schools, I wanted to shift this discussion to expose the similar logic in a space that we do not usually think of as a carceral space, public education. Because we forget that in public education, there are very many disabled children and especially disabled children of color and indigenous children who experience schooling in some of the most brutal, violent contexts. Here too, I want to remind you that ableist understandings of disability are used to justify why Black, brown, and indigenous children are overrepresented in alternative schools and juvenile detention centers. Many of these children, rather than receiving services and supports for the real trauma that is enacted in their lives because of racism, ableism, heterosexism, and the kinds of phobias that we have against people who are different, right? Is caused by all this trauma, and it is justified and treated as if these children are pathologically deviant, and I'm putting that in quotes. And I'm describing that as these systems make it as if the experiences of these children are something that lie completely within their bodies and not as a product or as the ways in which it intersects with the social environments and their own and who they are as individuals. And as a result, many of these children get sent down what has been called the school to prison pipeline. But actually, it's not really a pipeline because schools themselves are prison. And so I see that some of these children are moved along to different kinds or different levels of incarcerated spaces, which the worst part, the most incarcerated one being a juvenile detention, maybe juvenile detention centers. Okay. I also wanted to name that Black and Latino children in particular are overrepresented, those, particularly those who have the label of any kind of intellectual or cognitive disability, are usually, for the most part, found in, have not been found, have been designated to go to segregated classes because they are classified as having, as segregated classes. And most of these classrooms are, in fact, almost like prison-like settings, where the students get very little education. They're also oftentimes very punitive. And the logic for this incarceration is justified on the basis of keeping them safe from the rest of the public high school students, which is what a principal in one of the public schools told me when I asked about why was there such an intensive way to segregate these students. The other issue that I wanted to raise was, and the issue that has concerned me significantly, is the number of children who experience a lot of mental health issues and like depression, depression. I'm sorry that today yeah. So a lot of them are experiencing a lot of mental health issues, and they get little to no services in the public school system. And so with COVID-19, I am most concerned with the fact that a lot of these students, both in juvenile detention centers, as well as in the public school system, are now experiencing more isolation with the less of access to the minimal services that they experience. And the fact that some of these children some of these children it's been justified, especially in the juvenile detention centers, to keep these children for longer periods of time because they fear for their safety. So in fact, here disability and race are used to further justify these young people's incarceration in these units. So I was going to end by saying then that, and we can talk in the Q&A, is that we need to be very careful about the ways in which disability is framed in discussions of scarcity, precarity, which is in precarious conditions, and urgency. We need to pay attention to how ableist notions of disability are used to frame people at these intersections, because how we frame them plays a large part in how they are treated. And there's also a challenge, which is the one I really want us to think about as part of this webinar, to figure out ways in which we can offer services to these young people outside of the kind of medical industrial complex to which they're usually sent, and to look for alternative disability-centered collectives of care, which we have some resources at the end of this conversation that I hope we'll talk about. Thank you.
Okay, this is Dustin. Thank you, Nirmala. We're going to take just a quick 2-minute break, a pause for all of us to process, and then we'll come back and TL will speak for a little while. I've also dropped just a couple of links, and I'll continue to drop those in the chat from some of Nirmala's writings and some of her work. All right, we'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay. All right, I'll wait for one of the interpreters. Okay, cool. So yeah, as we move forward in this, we're going to use content and trigger warnings to the best of our abilities when we are talking about violences. I do want to let folks generally know that some of the discussion going forward will be talking about incarceration, deprivation, violence, all of which might be triggering, all of which may cause some type of pain, and want to welcome folks to exit and return as need be, and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But we will also try to the best of our ability to give a warning when we're talking about these things. I do want to say that I asked like all of the panelists to come as they are and ask them to not do any more work. Of course, like all of did do more work in preparation because that's typically what marginalized folks are used to doing. But I just want to honor the fact that the body of their work leading up into this moment is what we're actually witnessing now, and that is not something that could be studied or simply lived. A lot of people are experiencing it and forming analysis and studying it. And it's the reason that the body of knowledge is just so much. So in that vein, I want to introduce TL. Also to note that TL has done like a heavy portion of lifting to make this webinar possible. So thank TL for that. The access, the Spanish interpreters, the ASL interpreters, working with the interpreters and providing information on what we were going to cover tonight in order for interpreters to have an understanding, to be able to provide more access is critical to this, and it's critical to everything we do. And that's the type of labor that TL often does behind the scenes. But I will let TL come up and talk and be quiet.
This is TL. I'm a Black, young-ish, genderqueer person. I'm wearing circle glasses. They're like tortoiseshell. They're old, but they look new. I'm wearing a Black kind of high collar thing with a little button on the side. I'm seated in front of a bookshelf with pictures and books. Killing the Black Body is the first one that I can see right there by Dorothy Roberts. You all should check that out if you haven't read it yet. And I'm wearing a brimless cap. And Dustin Gibson, sign name DG, is constantly picking on me about my brimless cap, but I like it a lot. All right. I'm gonna give a content warning up front for all of the content that I'm about to share, because it's deeply distressing. A lot of the work that I do is unearthing histories that have been intentionally hidden away from our peoples for a very long time. By our peoples, I mean Indigenous, Black, Latinx folks, negatively racialized folks. I'm gonna ask Dustin if I start speaking too quickly or if I pause, if you could support me, just in case. And I appreciate also Dustin naming the fact that living at the intersections of where our ancestors lived and currently still live, and witnessing and experiencing all of the violences cause a particular reaction in our bodies and minds that sometimes makes it difficult to explain all of the things that might be running through our hearts and minds at any given one moment, and makes it hard to breathe and live sometimes. And I think it's important to name that. And it reminds me of something that Dustin says often, and it's about the crisis in people acknowledging so-called mental illnesses and neurodivergences and psychiatric disabilities is what they're formally termed, without acknowledging where those things might come from. So I often talk about trauma and deprivation being a cause and consequence of disability. And that in the US context, because of structural and systemic ableism, that trauma and deprivation, violence, and disability are also a cause and consequence of impoverishment. These are intentional systems that have been set up to trap people from particularized groups, Indigenous folks, Black folks, queer folks, and the list goes on, right? And so it's important to name that. And now I want to talk a little bit about history. Nirmala talked about these labels of cognitively deficient that were placed upon Indigenous folks and Black folks during enslavement, during genocides of all of our peoples, which are ongoing. We must name that, right? It has never ended. These genocides continue. And then post-enslavement as well. And I want to name the history of this thing. Specifically that the United States has always been very good at depriving folks of resources that are necessary for life and liberty and breath and families and all the positive things that we hope for everyone, regardless of their disability, regardless of their alleged race, regardless of their criminal status. Just to be able to exist, right? Without having your life halted or hampered or snuffed out by the violences of the states and corporations and capitalism. So the United States will deprive us of those things. So for instance, during enslavement, it was quite literally illegal for Black people to read and write. Our ancestors left evidence of eyes being gouged out, tongues being chopped off, hands being chopped off, simply for attempting to read and write, right? And of course, that was a maintenance of a very particularized system, whereby depriving folks of formalized education, white folks depriving Black folks and Indigenous folks of formalized education, made it such that they could more easily maintain their position of socioeconomic dominance after theft and pillage and rape in this country. So I have to name that. But what happened during this time, right, is that white folks said, well, here's what it means to be smart. Take this kind of test. If you can read and write, that means you are smart. Everyone who can't read and write, you're less than intelligent, right? And so we've created, by we, I mean white people, created these categories of people based on race. If your nose is this big, if your skin is this dark, a lot of very eugenics ideas around who is valuable, who is not, which Azza talked a lot about earlier. Categorize people by how much labor they could do, how much work they could do, how many babies they could produce after being bred and raped, right? That is what ableism entails, right? And if you now all of a sudden could not read and write because of all of the generations of deprivation of the right to read and write, you were labeled unintelligent. You were secluded, locked away, put away somewhere else, maimed, killed, incarcerated, institutionalized. That is the history of the United States, right? Drapetomania is something I have to talk about. It's a long word, so I'll just wait for the interpreter to spell it. Drapetomania. Drapetomania. This was an alleged disability that could only be had, according to white scientists, by Black people during enslavement. This was the alleged mental illness that Black folks had when they were quite literally obsessed with freedom. This is according to white scientists. These were mainstream scientists and doctors, mind you. They said that Black folks who were resisting enslavement, who were escaping enslavement, resisting forced labor, which is what plantations were, among other violent things, were in fact mentally ill. So not only was it a crime to escape, it became an alleged mental illness just to dream about freedom. Like, imagine that, right? Another alleged disability, mental illness that only Black people could get, according to white scientists, mainstream scientists, eugenicists, was called dysphagia aethiopica. It's spelled DYSATHIA space ATHOPICA or something to that effect. Look it up, it's there. This was actually work stoppages, right? So Azza mentioned resisting extraction of our labor, resisting capitalist and colonial imperialist systems that literally just want to take our bodies and mind and use them for their benefit and then throw us out. So when Black folks engaged in those work stoppages, we were again deemed, one, out of line with the natural order of things that we should be working. We were deemed lazy. We were deemed then mentally ill as well. When you look into the history of why a lot of Black folks found themselves incarcerated in institutions, mental health institutions, if you look at the label as to why they were there, it quite literally says freedom, right? So I want people to really understand clearly how the carceral system works. There's so much I want to share. I'm going to talk about two more things. I know I have like 2 minutes left. I want to talk about the United States Census of 1840 and 1880. The 1840 United States Census was allegedly the first time that white America was going to account for how many, and I quote, insane and idiots existed in the United States at the time, right? They specifically wanted to focus on enslaved Black population and the freed Northern Black populations. According to the 1840 census, go look it up, it's there, it's in the history books. They try to hide this stuff, but it's there. Black folks who were freed in the North had more incidences of insanity and idiocy than enslaved Black peoples in the enslaved South. The idea being that it was better for Black folks to be enslaved and being forced into labor, and that white folks were somehow doing Black folks some grand favor by allowing us to be enslaved and brutalizing us. Fast forward 40 years, this is post-emancipation, so now enslavement has formally ended, and there was the 1880 census. There was an attachment to the 1880 census that was called the 3D schedules. Now, the 3D schedules included people who were allegedly deficient, dependent, and delinquent. The first D might be wrong, but the point is, the idea was disability, alleged criminality, and dependency were created by the government. And of course, they said now all these formerly enslaved Black folks are a burden on the government. Mind you, we were emancipated without any material resources being provided to us, right? And so post-emancipation, there were laws like ugly laws that were established that were quite literally targeting Black formerly enslaved people, although a lot of white disability rights folks like to say that the ugly laws were specifically targeting just disabled people. Yes, disabled people, but mainly Black and Indigenous disabled folks who were forced to beg upon the street, who were maimed by the system, and veterans who had joined wars to fight for our freedoms, right? Like to literally give life for emancipation. So those are the two things I want folks to look at. And the last thing I'll mention is this connection between plantations, prisons, asylums, circuses, and zoos, right? Post-emancipation, a lot of folks found their way into prisons by design. And I don't have time to talk about that. There's a Q&A, I see Dustin's on the screen now. Plantations and asylums, again, the connection between those, I can't get into right now, but you must take a look at it. Asylums, interestingly enough, the St. Elizabeth's institution right here in DC used to actually house animals from the National Zoo. And before zoos housed animals, they actually housed Black and brown indigenous peoples who were put on display for white people to go and pay money to oogle Black people and disabled people, and usually Black and indigenous disabled people who were in freak shows at circuses. So zoos and circuses are very similar in that post-emancipation, Black and indigenous bodies weren't making sufficient enough money, capital, for white people, and they established these other institutions, prisons, psych wards, insurance companies, big pharmaceutical companies, circuses. These things were ways to, again, further extract and exploit and make money off of our bodies and minds. And I'll stop there. Go ahead, Dustin.
This is Dustin. Thank you, TL. And that leads us right into Dorian. I'm super excited to have met and excited to build community with Dorian. What TL was finishing on talking about the connections between different forms of incarceration is one of the reasons that we wanted to host this tonight. We felt as though on one side of the aisle, disability rights movement or groups in large are not necessarily focused on jails and prisons or the people in them. And then we felt like the movements to decarcerate jails and prisons were not focused on psych institutions and asylums and nursing facilities and all of the congregate care settings in which disabled people are often disappeared to. And that is where the work that Dorian does lives. So yeah, without further ado, Dorian.
Hi, my name is Dorian. I am a Black, masculine, light-skinned, Black, masculine presenting person. I have on bluish tortoiseshell glasses and a brown and blue plaid button-up shirt. I have a headphones on and a black cap. I also want to say thank you very much for including me in this panel with all of these wonderful minds. And yeah, this actually dovetails really perfectly with what I have to say, that yes, as you know, as mentioned before, criminality, race, and disability are social constructs deeply connected with labor. And these dynamics, you know, are needed to control societal access. And we view disability as someone who is disabled based on their perceived ability to earn capital and have access to that. And these make or break who has access to education, medical care, jobs, and empathy. And I think it's important to mention empathy because institutions such as group homes, nursing care facilities are often seen as better alternatives to prisons. And and better access and alternatives to prisons, which they are not. We can't allow institutions to perpetuate themselves under the guise of care and rehabilitation. And we have a model for how this was historically done in cognitive and intellectually disabled communities when we traded these wider forms of institutions for institution lives in the terms of group homes, and as a socially acceptable model of institutions and segregation. So therefore, these intersections also create, you know, racialized ableism as a form of violence, because BIPOC community, we are largely shoved away to these facilities. And these equalities are becoming clearer in the rise of the COVID epidemic. This rising death toll and lack of empathy is given to people in these institutions. Folks in group homes are often, and nursing home facilities are often congregated in in thick places, and we see them now as being hotspots for the virus. And BIPOC community also are more likely to live in areas with less access to adequate hospital care, and historically denied life-saving treatments and prior existence, also giving them more access to disability. And with this creates less access to care, which is written in laws. With as Azza mentioned earlier, the hospital guidelines are able to reallocate resources, basically meaning they get to pick and choose and prioritize patients with better prognosis or greater need. And this means that disabled care, elders, people with higher weights who need acute care, these policies are created to restrict access to that. And when we speak about abolition of institutions as a whole, generally, these facilities are left out of the conversation, largely because of the lack of empathy to these communities. So yeah, trying to think, but that's pretty much what I have to say on the topic.
All right, Dorian, appreciate you. So we're gonna take just like a couple minute break, and then we'll come back. And Cyree we'll talk, and then we'll go to question and answer after that. So a 2-minute break. All right, this is Dustin. Based off of some of the things that Dorian had mentioned and Azza, I do want to note that marginalized communities, particularly Black folks, are disproportionately represented in the population of people that are in nursing facilities that are under the age of 60. That's something that's often left out of conversations as well. That has a lot to do with, one, medical racism, along with the lacking of home and community-based services that are in our neighborhoods, in our communities. And it's about the devaluing of care work in general. Care attendants that folks are interdependent upon in order to survive, to live, to have some type of quality of life, are not getting paid even close to a livable wage. They're not getting the benefits of unions oftentimes. So that's also part of why ableism is something that is rooted, or capitalism is part and parcel of ableism. So if we're really talking about dismantling ableism, we also have to be talking about capitalism and labor as well, as Dorian brilliantly tied together. The next person up is Cyree Jarelle Johnson. Cyree is a writer and a poet and an activist and a librarian and a lot of things. We're both a part of Harriet's Collective. So I'm proud to be in community with Cyree, and I know that Cyree is going to offer us a lot.
Oh, my bad. Hi, everybody. I'm Cyree Jarelle Johnson. I am Black trans fag. I am effeminately presenting. I'm also femme presenting. I'm wearing a Black polo with lime green trim on the sleeves and a double lime green stripe on the neck and a zipper instead of a button, of course. And there are some pictures behind me. You can see a cord on my sofa. And I'm gonna work really hard to speak slowly. I'm a hyperverbal autistic, and that is a problem for me and has been my whole life. So if at any point I'm speaking too quickly, please do drop it in the chat because I am trying really hard. So I appreciate the historical foundation that all of these people that I respect so much have given to grounding movements in disability justice. And I will say that what I'm going to talk about today is a lot more timely. I live with CPTSD, and I have very difficult and complicated feelings about trigger warnings because most of the things that come out of my mouth are going to be triggering. And that's a conversation for another time, but just do know that. So what I came here to talk to you about today specifically is hydroxychloroquine and the shortage that's going on right now. And so what's interesting is that hydroxychloroquine has been billed in the media as an anti-malarial, which it is. But the thing that people don't say about malaria a lot anymore is that malaria and immunity, or supposed immunity and increased resistance to malaria, is actually one of the reasons why Black people were chosen for chattel enslavement in the United States. So Black people, specifically from Central and West Africa, were found to have a resistance to malaria. And so we were trafficked into parts of the United States. I see that the interpreter did not get to spell hydroxychloroquine. Is there anything that I should do, TL? Yeah, hydroxychloroquine, HYDROXYCHLOROQUINE, hydroxychloroquine. So an immunity to malaria is part of the reason why Black people from West and Central Africa were trafficked to the United States, specifically to the mid-Atlantic states that had enslavement, like the New York, where I'm living in the colony of New York, right on down to Georgia, because these places were malarial swamps. So people were dying of malaria left and right because there was mosquitoes there. And the reason for that immunity is actually thought to be because of sickle cell trait. Great, it's going to be in the transcript. Because of sickle cell trait. So it was actually a history of Black specific diseases that are inextricably tied with the history of Black people in this country and also disabled people in the country because of the link between sickle cell and how the prevalence of those traits mixed with malaria. And so you had a population that was ill and also subject to a lot of sunlight and becoming more ill. And so that's part of the history of the United States and slavery too. So hydroxychloroquine is used to treat rheumatological diseases. It's considered the standard of care, which means a great many of us take it. And because lupus in specific, I live with lupus, did not have many medications to treat it in general. Hydroxychloroquine was one of the first medications that was specifically approved to treat lupus specifically. It is a medication that's out of patent, right? So it's a pretty old medication, but Trump is also invested in at least one company that makes hydroxychloroquine. So there's no way to think of his intentions for saying hydroxychloroquine on TV as being inherently pure, because he is at least in some small way benefiting from the idea that hydroxychloroquine is treating COVID-19, which again, it has not been proven to do. In the months of March and April, hydroxychloroquine was one of the most searched terms on Google. Purchasing of the medication by hospitals and also surreptitiously by doctors doubled in the first 2 weeks of March, which left the medication in very short supply. At no point has this been still approved to treat COVID-19. In fact, there are some studies that show it might actually make it worse or make people more likely to die, but because there have been no controlled studies, we don't know. And of course, where are they testing this? Okay, so they're testing hydroxychloroquine in prisons. They're testing hydroxychloroquine in nursing facilities, in care facilities. And because of that, we're seeing this new class of how incarceration means that, this next iteration of how incarceration means also being tested upon so that other people can experience medical advances, right? Because we're not thinking about the known therapeutic uses of hydroxychloroquine when we're talking about hydroxychloroquine on the news. We're talking about attempting to save otherwise healthy people from illness. And it's very likely that disabled people, even if it was shown to work, would not be offered these if they were life-sustaining treatments. So, and part of that is due to the fact that the people who are considered greatest at risk are people who also have racialized diseases. We know that diabetes, asthma, high blood pressure, all of these things are far more common in Black and Indigenous and Latinx communities. So it's not for nothing that the idea that, oh, well, you know, it's only people with these diseases who are going to die, right? I can say with lupus, which is a disease that overwhelmingly affects Black people who are estrogen dominant in our bodies. And because of that, it is usually a disease that people do not associate with needing care or people who deserve care here in the United States. So, and that has also extended to COVID-19. The question really is whose medication gets taken away in times like this? How is it taken and why? And also to some extent by whom? I cannot keep up with both these chats, and so I'm going to try to hide them, but it is blinking at me. Great. So in that same vein, there we go. So in that same vein, as concerning as the problem of an actual medication shortage is, what's more concerning was the silence of our movements. I knew that there was going to be a hydroxychloroquine shortage as I started seeing the president say it on the news. Now, Dr. Fauci actually has a very long history and complicated history with people with immune system disorders and diseases, right? So Dr. Fauci first came to fame during the beginnings of HIV, and started out as someone who had a very confrontational relationship with HIV and AIDS activists, and ended up being someone who ended in a more advocate kind of role, right? But when we see Dr. Fauci today on, or these days on the news, he is not also advocating for talking about hydroxychloroquine as a lupus drug, or complicating the reasons that people with diabetes or asthma or hypertension are being disproportionately affected by these, by COVID-19. And so that's a real problem. The shortage started around March 1st, and within a week, it was almost impossible to get hydroxychloroquine. I myself was offered only a 14-day supply of a medication that I have taken twice a day, every day for the last 10 years. I asked why I was not able to access my medication. And pharmacists told me directly that it was because doctors and dentists had ordered it for themselves to stockpile for their friends and loved ones. Why are doctors able to stockpile medications without an associated diagnosis for their friends and loved ones, when if I try to fill my medication a day early, I am turned away from the pharmacy, or I have to, or if I can pay out of pocket, I might be encouraged to do so. But generally, I'm just told I cannot buy my medication. So why are certain people allowed to circumvent what is considered policy in order to just keep some just in case, right? What president says names of medication directly on the internet as though people are not going to try to obtain that drug, especially when they're told that a life-threatening disease is making its way around the country and the world. And so it not only did that put us at risk, it also did so wantonly, did so without any kind of concern for people who were already using that medication. That's convenient and easy to do, exactly because of the people who contract rheumatological diseases, right? Much like sickle cell, lupus is associated specifically with Black people. So that leads me to the question of our movements, right? So where were people who do gender justice work, right? 90% of people with lupus are people who are estrogen dominant or women. It is odd that there was no concern for whether or not, a disease that mostly affects women, no one cared that we were all about to lose our medication or potentially lose our medication, especially after Donald Trump pissed off Prime Minister Modi because 50% of our hydroxychloroquine supply comes from India currently. So it's also an issue of international relations as well, and who can afford to be dragged into Trump's constant wars. At the same time, lupus disproportionately affects Black people. Where was the movement for Black lives? I can say for myself and the organizations that I've worked for over the past 5 years, we have worked pretty consistently to bring the movement for Black lives up to speed on disability justice. Where are they? Why have they said nothing about this? If this disease disproportionately affects Black people, and it does, what has happened to make that a gap in their compassion and coverage? Yeah, it's big. Dustin, I'm seeing you back on. I have one more thing to say. Okay, yeah. So this is actually not something new. So last year, Trump announced that he was going to change the way that kidney disease was treated in the country, and that by 2025, he wanted there to be 80% of new diagnoses with kidney diseases, which is something that's very common for people with lupus, were to be transferred to home care. So, and now with COVID-19, we're seeing an increase in the need for dialysis as well. I want people to consider how Trump is directly benefiting from these illnesses. And also, even though home care is definitely a goal of independent living movements that would be cared for in our homes and in our communities, what does it mean when the government does it and no one else is watching? That's all I have to say, Dustin.
Well, thank you, Cyree. And I deeply appreciate the bringing in the international perspective to understand that these systems are working globally. It calls on us to think about imperialism and the role in which the U.S. plays around the world, and not only the exacerbation of disability, but also the creation of disability and using it as a part of war and a weapon. Speaking specifically to places like Palestine, or places have sanctions on them like Venezuela or Iran. We'll answer, well, I'll pose a couple questions that have been dropped in the chat throughout this. What I'm going to do is read about 4 of them, and then whoever wants to respond can respond. I ask that you keep it as brief as possible because we don't have a lot of time. The first question is, I'm wondering if you could all speak to the expected labor of educating non-disabled Black, Indigenous, people of color you have to work or engage with who continue to uphold normative standards, specifically in relation to how they feel so confident in speaking to social justice and racial justice, but don't have an understanding of disability justice and how it inherently intersects. I will also drop that in the chat for the panelists. Next question is, as a disabled person who has been doing a lot of organizing recently with abled radical folks, I've been fighting a lot of ableism. It feels like I've been saying the same things over and over ad nauseum to try and get them to slow down the pace, focus on access, etc. What are some ways that you might suggest I could encourage them to ground work more structurally and intentionally in disability justice? And the last question is, how do you view the perception of disability within minority groups? In your experience, which community as a whole shows more empathy and creates accessibility initially? The majority, white race, or minorities? How do we tackle the lack of education about disability with minority groups, specifically the Black community? So I put all of those into the chat. Whoever would like to respond first can just turn on their camera and just announce your name.
This is TL. I wanted to jump in just for the sake of time and touch on one important part of disability justice. The reason why disability justice is so critical a lens and praxis for all movements is because it acknowledges that there are reasons why Black and Indigenous folks and other negatively racialized folks do not identify as disabled, do not necessarily understand a lot of the connections between those things, and it doesn't chastise for that. It says, hey, let's acknowledge the violent histories behind Black folks who were labeled as disabled, being forced separated from families, being institutionalized, being killed by cops, and so on and so forth, right? Being put into prisons. And it says, and let's figure out, and the other thing disability justice is critical for is that it acknowledges our cultural truths, right? So Black and Indigenous communities generally have different language to explain things related to disability. We might not ever use the word disability, but when in fact we are discussing disability, and that's something that we have to acknowledge as well. And that's something that disability justice holds together with the complexity of the ableism that all of us continue to experience, which is why we're extremely exhausted with general movements in general. So I want to acknowledge and affirm the several people who are naming that there's a lot of ableism within Black, Indigenous, negatively racialized communities. I encourage you all to do your own study of folks who are making the connections and then figuring out how to loop those movements that you're involved within on some of the stuff, some of the work that we're talking about here. And obviously the trail was laid long before we existed. I have to name Leroy Moore, Patty Byrne. There's a number of folks who are our elders, Karima, who you all should be studying and learning and understanding that this journey, didn't start with just a few of us who are on the call here. So that's all I'm going to say. Go ahead.
I I just kind of wanted to kind of dovetail what TL had to say, that we have to consider the fact that even who has access and the safeness to call themselves disabled is racialized in a sense, and these 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 systems of violence. Sorry, I'm getting a little nonverbal right now. These systems of violence often perpetuate themselves, and the police violence, school to prison pipeline, etc. And even who has access to getting certain diagnoses to have access to care. So that there is a very long history behind that, and why there might appear to be less empathy in BIPOC communities.
This is Cyree. I am gonna just speak to the question, how do you view the perception of disability within minority groups? In your experience, which community as a whole shows more empathy and creates accessibility initially? The majority of white race or minorities? How do we tackle the lack of education about disability within minority groups, specifically the Black community? I will say none of the communities are doing a great job. Everyone is doing bad. And I think that in terms of disability justice, I think that, and we'll have to include disability rights, because disability rights and disability justice are in no way the same thing. But I think that white disability rights folks have themselves set an accessible framework, right? So it's certainly not white people who are doing this, right? It was actually white disability rights folks who kept a great many of disabilities that disproportionately affect Black and brown people from being considered disabilities. And some of them will still fight you about it to this day, right? And I say that as a person with lupus. So until the standards of disability were changed, and within my adult lifetime, I'm 31 years old, but I can remember when this changed. Lupus was always really embattled, and lupus can and will kill you, right? It does not kill everyone, but it can, in fact, it can be a very deadly disease. So that is white disability rights folks. I will say that Black people in specific responses, or the Black community's responses to accessibility and disability, are very colored by enslavement. So like the idea of disability during enslavement was very embattled and very dangerous to be a disabled. I mean, it's embattled and dangerous to be a disabled person now. But a lot of the concepts that we think of in terms of disability now, like in terms of illness, were tied to productivity. So the idea of calling yourself disabled is sometimes still associated with not being productive, or being someone who complains, right? And these things can sometimes be culturally risky in Black communities. I can't say that it is true more so than any other community, because I've been Black this whole time, and so I really can't compare in those ways. But I think that generally accessibility is a project that an entire society takes on, and disability justice ideally is a project that an entire society takes on as well. So I don't know that ranking them is very useful.
Thank you. Inviting Nirmala or Azza, if either of you wanted to respond briefly.
I'm Nirmala, and thank you for actually those questions. But I was going to add just another little sticky point in this whole discussion, because one of the assumptions is that disability is kind of what I said, I was trying to explain earlier, that disability is not just biological in some ways, it's also historical. So there is a really fraught or a tense relationship between disability and race. In fact, the actual processes of slavery, colonialism, and even now capitalism, if you work in factories, you get impairments. And so disabled, and in schools, in the context in which I was talking, disabled people get particular labels because because of how the schools constitute Black and people of color as disabled. So in fact, disability is like we have to have an understanding or a way of figuring out how to keep both disability and race as categories or identities that both affirm but can also, based on an ableist understanding of disability, challenge the ways in which disabled people, people of color, experience disability. Because how do you, it's one of those sticking points, how do you celebrate an experience of yourself that has been produced by the violence of capitalism? So when one of you had asked the question about how do you teach, what I have to, when I teach about the relationship of race and disability, I talk not so much about the fact that disability is inherently this kind of negative experience, because we know that's what disability justice says, that it's something, but we have to look at the conditions. What are the conditions that create both racism and disability, which is transnational capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, the ways in which the healthcare and the issue of labor, and the ways in which healthcare and education constitute certain bodies, the kind of the eugenic logic that we had talked about, to decide which bodies are disposable and which are not. So it's more important for us when we talk about disability justice to also talk about the forces that create these identities, rather than to locate these identities as either competitive with each other or in some ways also as both that can be collapsed into each other.
Okay, thank you, Nirmala. This is Dustin. We'll send a follow-up email with the recording of the webinar along with the transcript. I know there was issues with the caption. For that, I apologize, and we will attempt to get that figured out. And hopefully the transcript doesn't have those same issues. We'll also send some of the resources and references that have been dropped in the chat today with ways to connect and contact all of the panelists. If the panelists are okay with dropping their Cash Apps or Venmos or PayPals in the chat, that's fine. If not, we will find a way, if you want to distribute funds to any of the panelists through that follow-up email. I guess in closing, I just want to thank everyone who tuned in on Zoom, thank everyone who tuned in on Facebook. And if this is something that you all want to continue and have more of, then I'm going to leave that to the people to decide and let us know. Also, again, a huge thank you to the interpreters. It is especially important in these times to think of interpreters and people that are helping folks provide access as essential workers as well, that deserve to be paid for labor and have that. So again, thank you, and we will be signing off.
Very exciting.